Hi folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the issue of are there forces at work, because there appear to be, are there forces at work that are deliberately and willfully fomenting or trying to stir up racial hatred to a point where it could easily lead to a form of civil war, or at least very widespread unrest. Now, there was a guy recently who went around saying it's okay to be white, and he was arrested, accused of being a neo-Nazi, and thrown in prison for stirring up race hatred. Now, the case wasn't really proven that he'd stirred up anything. But the case really revolved around reversing the burden of proof. Okay, we're going to say that you did stir up racial hatred, or you were trying to. You need to prove that you didn't. And the evidence bar that the prosecutors had to meet was very low. A very activist judge as well helped, but they could effectively accuse him of saying, well, you had a book in your house about World War II. And in that book, the name Hitler was mentioned. Therefore, you are a worshipper of Hitler. You are therefore a Nazi. You are therefore, and so they can use this thing that the leftist ideological sort of warriors use, that automatic sort of escalation of things. You drank water yesterday when you were thirsty. Hitler also drank water. Therefore, you are Hitler. That type of logic. A table has four legs, a cow has four legs, therefore a cow is a table. Now, what happens though when a minority, someone from a minority group does, and not only just says something sort of that really is no great shakes or no big deal, but says something that's blatantly and brazenly untrue for the purposes of stirring up racial hatred, and more to the point, or as much to the point, stirring up a view among minorities that, well, those laws are white man's laws. You don't have to follow them. Those laws are, they're not legitimate. That's white man's law, white man's constitution. That's white man's legal system, white man's courts, white man's. That doesn't apply to you. You'd have to do what they say. Now, that's creating some conditions and circumstances that are not good for young black men that assume that the only laws they need to follow are the laws of the ghetto that they live in, and the idea that there are laws outside of that, their laws of their family, their neighborhood, their gangs, not that other stuff. That's just nonsense. Why do I have to listen to that? Why do I have to do what Whitey says? And then if Whitey tries to get me to do this or that or obey these laws, then Whitey's being unjust to me. I have a right to fight back. If I as a black guy kill a white guy for no reason, then it doesn't matter, because their mere existence, white people's existence, the mere fact that I'm required to abide by their laws, that is in itself a disrespect, which means I'm allowed to go and kill them whenever I want to. Now, that sort of talk, if a white person was saying, you got a right to kill a black person whenever you want. I mean, if there's a white guy saying that quite reasonably, they would be called to account for that, and would probably place charges, and may even get do a custodial sentence, or be fined, or something, something. But black hucksters, race grifters, and so on, they were able to do all of these things and much worse without any accountability. And I think it's time that there is accountability. Now, there are some simple things when that Camalo Anthony, 17-year-old black kid in Texas, he murdered that white boy, or it's alleged he murdered that white boy. Now, the legal representative that the family has hired, or I assume is providing their services for free, I don't know, they are using, or at least so far, using the defense that well, he kind of really didn't do anything wrong. We're the victims here. The black kid is the victim, but he the charges are that he murdered this. Yeah, but mean, it's white man's law, white man's this, white man's that. What are you talking about? There's no real crime here, and therefore, what's all the fun? That sort of attitude, and it goes back into this narrative of, well, white man's laws don't really apply to us. Now, there's quite a few black race hustlers around the United States and elsewhere, by the way, Britain, Australia too. And they all seem to stick pretty tightly to the same message, which suggests, if not screams, that it's being centrally coordinated and scripted and funded by NGOs and so on for the sole purpose of causing disruption to race relations. And of course, they use a similar playbook for gender relations as well. As long as you've got the races arguing and bickering, and women women sort of bickering, you're saying men are all evil, Nazi, fascist, misogynist, patriarchy oppressors, as long as you got those two narratives running unchallenged and unchecked. Now, of course, to do this, they have to tell the most terrible lies, which is really the issue here. So, so just looking at a few videos around, they're online. And to my knowledge, none of these videos have been called out. There's no national shaming or blaming of these hustlers and grifters, race hustlers and grifters. Instead, they're able to say the most ridiculous things. Coming back again to this Carmelo Anthony thing, the legal representative they had is saying, well, Kyle Rittenhouse just was shooting people in the back, shooting people, just random. No, stop. These were people chasing him, pointing guns at him and goodness knows what. And they weren't shot in the back. So there's no comparison here. What's the what? So but as far as I know, there was no pushback on that. That guy wasn't dragged into some national media station and castigated roundly and thoroughly for making that false claim. But talking to or looking at other videos, there's one black guy doing the rounds where he's saying, look, white people's laws, constitutional, this sort of stuff, doesn't apply to us. It doesn't apply to us black folks. They're just old white people. And same as the feminists say, well, old white men made the laws that keep women in chains. They're using. So again, the guy is being funded and organised and scripted by other forces here, and given a very large platform. There's a gathering there of over 1,000 black people. And so he proceeds to tell them, he said, look, white people went to Africa, kidnapped all these black people. They just ran around. Rando kidnapped our black people. Rando kidnapped them. While they were screaming for their mama. And then put them in chains. And there was 10 million people per square inch on the ship. And they kept them in bondage. They whipped and beaten to death every day. And lie after lie after lie after lie after lie. So because of that, we don't have to follow white man's laws. We don't have to do what the white man says. Now, when you're living in a civil society, or the civis, it's not helpful when 10% plus of the population is told you don't have to follow the laws. You don't have to do what they say. Their laws are legitimate. White people are illegitimate. And if you kill white people, you're kind of not really doing anything wrong. But if they kill you, those damn so. A lot of these young black men, they're not high IQ people. So they would listen to, hey, that's right, yeah, whitey, that white cop, if that white cop stops me for anything, I can just kill him. There's nothing wrong with that. Or those sorts of things. Well, I don't have to do what the judge says. Or, those laws don't apply to me. And so the recipe for civic unrest is huge. And you can see how quickly black neighborhoods can turn into absolutely conflagration, riots everywhere you look. And this sort of rhetoric, this sort of talk, these sort of claims, false as they are justifying and legitimizing that sort of behavior. Firstly, just on the issue of blacks were being enslaved for thousands of years before white folks came along. That for some reason black people don't seem to know that. I don't know why. The next thing that's big issue is that I don't think there was any blacks that were enslaved by white people. They were all enslaved by other blacks, maybe some of the Arabic slave trader guy, but they weren't. And they were brought to the coastal ports. This is on West Africa. Brought to the coast by other blacks. And then the white folks showed up with their boats and took them to North America, South America, the Caribbean and so on. Now, the idea that they were packed in like sardines and they all died on the way, that wouldn't work. The only way that they needed to get, the slave ships needed to make a fully healthy, fit, ready to work in tip-top condition slave would fetch about $800. Now, a slave that was ill, unable to work, was needing medical attention, they'd be lucky to get anything for somebody like that. So the only way the slave ships could make money is if they brought fit, healthy, ready-to-work slaves to workers. I mean, we're talking workers here, ready to work on plantations or whatever the work was. I'm assuming agricultural work here, but so that's it. Now, if they were packed in like sardines, like they say, with meager diets, and they were beaten and whipped, and they weren't given water, and they arrived emaciated and dying of thirst and full of disease and pestilence and so on. No, they wouldn't have got a nickel or a dime for the people in that condition. So, and if you look at the sort of things that the slaves were required to do, the jumping and the hopping and to prove that they were in good physical conditions, some of those were quite rigorous, sort of calisthenics almost. And that was the only way that a good price was going to be fetched. So they had to arrive in tip-top condition if that was going to be. And the bucks were serious. Even a slave that sort of looked like had possibilities, but wasn't in particularly good condition. How does the purchaser know? He could die tomorrow. How do I know he's not? So they didn't fetch very good prices at all. And you see, where there's doubt over the health and the fitness, they're going out for like $50 a throw. No one's going to make money at that. So they had to arrive in tip-top condition. Similarly, once the slaves were put to work, the idea they were beaten to death every day is bullshit. These slaves had to be ready to work and able to work. And they had to be well enough treated where they didn't need close order supervision for everything they did. That would have, then you got to hire all the overseers and managers and foremen and work group leaders, all that. Why get all that? So slaves had to be well enough fed to be able to do the work, well enough clothed. They had to, there had to be a degree of trust between the folks on the plantation. Well, go over there, Rastus, and do this, plant those crops, or bring in those fruit or something, whatever the job they were given, chop those trees down. There had to be a degree of trust there, and they had to be left alone to do the work. And therefore that required at least some sort of relationship between the slaves and the owners. The idea of slave, like one person owning another, I think we get carried away with that today and rather misread. At the time, back in the day, slavery was considered the standard way you solved labor shortages all over the world, not just in America, not just in Africa or whatever, but all over the world. That was how you solved labor shortages. Slaves, and then to get slaves, you had to go to the places that had surplus populations, which was Africa, and also you had to get workers that could do the work, of course, but you had to get workers that weren't susceptible to white man's diseases. Now the natives and the Caribbean islanders, all those sort of people, the South Americans, they were very susceptible to white man's diseases, smallpox, cholera, that sort of stuff. So whereas black people weren't, they weren't or were much less susceptible. So the idea of working in the swamps and difficult conditions and so on, the black workers were able to do that sort of work. So the idea that it was just rando grabbing black people's lives. Now all this thing needs to be explained. But the black hustlers and grifters that are telling these terrible lies, if it was a white person doing it, there would be a national outrage and they'd be in prison. And the same thing needs to be done here, I believe. People that are out actively and aggressively stirring up trouble like this, and this is factual. Just factual. That's another thing. But making up stories and creating this absurd narrative, then that's something that needs to be clamped down on, I believe. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.